Have you ever stopped to wonder why, among all the stories in the Bible, the one about a foreign, widowed and penniless woman got an entire book dedicated to her? Why did God choose to record Ruth's journey in such detail, a Moabite woman who, by law, should have been far from Israel's promises? The answer to these questions reveals one of the deepest mysteries about God's character and his plan of redemption for all humanity. Ruth wasn't just a faithful woman, she was a divine instrument prepared to change the course of salvation history. In this video, you'll discover how one person's faithfulness can unleash miracles that echo through generations. We'll see how God transforms bitterness into hope, scarcity into abundance, and despair into an eternal legacy. Get ready, because this isn't just Ruth's story. It's the story of how God works through those who choose to remain faithful, even when all hope seems lost. And maybe, by the end of this journey, you'll understand that your own story of faithfulness might be writing eternal chapters you can't quite see yet. Ruth's story kicks off amidst one of the most devastating situations a woman could face back then: widowhood, poverty, and the prospect of a hopeless future. After her husband's death, she finds herself at a crossroads that would define not only her destiny, but the destiny of entire nations. Naomi, her mother-in-law, also widowed and bitter from losing her two sons, decides to return to her homeland, Bethlehem, and releases her daughters-in-law to go back to their own families. It was the most logical, safest, and most understandable decision anyone could make under those circumstances. But Ruth does something extraordinary. She doesn't just choose to stay with Naomi, she makes a vow that echoes through the centuries. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Ruth 1:16. These words weren't just a declaration of family loyalty, they were a declaration of absolute faith in a God she was still getting to know. Ruth was giving up the security of her land, her family, and her gods to embrace the unknown, guided only by the conviction that Naomi's God was worthy of all trust. Ruth's faithfulness wasn't naive or impulsive. She had observed Naomi's faith for years, even amidst the tragedies that struck their family. While Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, made the rational choice to return to her people, Ruth made the choice of faith. She understood something profound, that true security isn't found in favorable circumstances, but in the presence of the living God. Her decision to follow Naomi was, in fact, a decision to follow the God of Israel, no matter the cost. This unwavering loyalty amidst adversity reveals a fundamental principle of God's kingdom. Faithfulness is tested and forged in the fires of hardship. Ruth could have chosen the easy path, but she chose the path of faith. And it's precisely at this point that God begins to weave his miraculous plan. Because when we remain faithful to God and his purposes, even when we can't see the way ahead, we're positioning ourselves to witness divine interventions that go beyond our understanding. But what happens when a foreign woman with no rights and no resources arrives in a land that isn't hers? How would God transform this seemingly impossible situation into one of the greatest miracles of provision and redemption ever recorded? When Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem, they bring nothing but their lives and their faith. The Bible records that they arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest, a detail that seems casual but reveals the surgical precision of God's timing. It wasn't just any time of year, it was precisely when there would be work opportunities in the fields and a chance for sustenance. God was orchestrating every detail, even before they realized his hand was at work. This is the first glimpse of how divine providence operates, behind the scenes, setting the stage for his purposes to unfold. Ruth, showing initiative and courage, asks Naomi for permission to go glean in the fields, a practice allowed by Mosaic law that ensured the poor and foreigners could collect the grains that fell during the harvest. And here's where something happens that Scripture describes as seemingly casual. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, Ruth 2:3. The phrase "as it turned out" might suggest coincidence, but for those who see with spiritual eyes, there are no coincidences in God's kingdom, only divine providence. Boaz wasn't just a rich man. He was a close relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, which qualified him as a potential goal, the family redeemer. But Ruth didn't know that when she entered his field. She was simply being faithful in doing what was within her power, working honestly to provide for herself. And as she worked diligently and humbly, God was connecting the dots of a plan she couldn't even imagine existed. Divine providence doesn't just operate in big, spectacular miracles. It operates in the seemingly insignificant details that, when viewed in retrospect, reveal a perfect design. Can you see how God was working? While Ruth was simply trying to survive another day, God was positioning her in the exact place where his promise of redemption would be fulfilled. Boaz notices Ruth among all the workers, asks about her, and upon hearing her story of faithfulness to Naomi, he blesses her, saying, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12. Unbeknownst to him, Boaz was prophesying about himself. He would be the instrument of that divine reward. But God's providence doesn't stop at providing daily bread. Something much bigger was being prepared. How would a simple field worker become part of the lineage of Israel's greatest king, and even more importantly, of the Messiah himself? God's law established in Israel contained an extraordinary provision called levirate marriage and the concept of the goel, the kinsman redeemer. When a man died without leaving heirs, his closest relative had the right and responsibility to marry the widow, acquire her property, and produce offspring who would carry the deceased's name. This wasn't just a social custom, it was a divine law that protected widows, preserved family inheritances, and ensured that no lineage in Israel would be wiped out. It was a system of redemption established by God himself, an earthly reflection of a much deeper spiritual reality. Boaz fit this role perfectly. He was a qualified goel, a close relative with the resources to redeem Elimelech's property and restore the family's inheritance. But there was a crucial detail. There was another relative, even closer, who had legal priority. Boaz, being a man of integrity, couldn't simply ignore the law and take Ruth for himself. He needed to follow the correct process, respecting both God's law and the other relative's rights. This is a powerful lesson on how God operates. He doesn't break his own laws to fulfill his purposes. He works through them. When Ruth, following Naomi's wise counsel, goes to the threshing floor where Boaz is working and lies down at his feet, she's making a formal request for redemption. This act, which might seem strange to our modern culture, was a culturally appropriate way for a widow to request that her kinsman redeemer fulfill his responsibility. Boaz responds with honor and respect. "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier, for you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." Ruth 3:10. He recognizes Ruth's virtue and promises to resolve the matter legally. The redemption process that follows is fascinating. Boaz goes to the city gate, the place where legal matters were settled, and presents the situation to the closest relative in the presence of witnesses and elders. The other relative initially agrees to redeem the property, but when he discovers that this includes marrying Ruth, and that any child born would inherit the property in the deceased's name, he refuses, saying, "I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own inheritance." Ruth 4:6. And just like that, the way opens for Boaz to fulfill his role as redeemer, not through manipulation or shortcuts, but through the legal process established by God. This earthly redemption story points to something infinitely greater, Just as Boaz redeemed Ruth, paying the necessary price to restore her inheritance and dignity, there's a greater Redeemer who paid an infinitely higher price to rescue us. But how did Ruth's faith manifest in concrete actions throughout this entire process? Real faith is never passive. James, Jesus' brother, would write centuries later, "Faith without deeds is dead," James 2:26. And Ruth's story is a perfect example of this principle. From the moment she made her vow of loyalty to Naomi, every step she took was a practical demonstration of her faith. She didn't just sit around waiting for God to do everything while she did nothing. She moved in faith, taking the initiatives within her reach, trusting that God would bless her efforts. When they got to Bethlehem, Ruth didn't just wait for provision to fall from the sky. She told Naomi, "Let me go out to the fields and pick up leftover grain behind anyone who's kind enough to let me." Ruth 2:2. She was ready to work, to humble herself, to do whatever it took within the bounds of honor and dignity. Gleaning in the fields was tough work, usually for the poorest folks in society. For a woman who had been married to a respectable family man, this could have felt pretty humiliating. But Ruth didn't let pride stop her from doing what needed to be done. Her faith showed up in practical, diligent action. Later, when Naomi cooked up a plan for Ruth to approach Boaz and formally ask for redemption, Ruth once again showed her faith through courageous obedience. She simply replied, "I'll do whatever you tell me." Ruth 3:5. Going to the threshing floor at night and lying at Boaz's feet took some serious guts. She was putting herself in a vulnerable spot, risking her reputation and dignity. But she trusted Boaz's character, Naomi's wisdom, and most importantly, God's providence. Her faith wasn't just some theoretical belief, it was an active trust that pushed her way past her comfort zone. Throughout the whole redemption process, while Boaz was sorting out the legal stuff, Ruth carried on with dignity and patience. She didn't get anxious, didn't try to manipulate things, and didn't look for shortcuts. She had done her part. Now she waited in faith for God to finish the work. This is a deep lesson for all of us. True faith moves us to act when it's time to act, but it also gives us peace to wait when it's time to trust. Ruth perfectly embodied both aspects, and that's why she became a model of active faith for all generations. Ruth's faith was rewarded not just with provision and security, but with something way bigger. But what can we learn about character and integrity from the man God chose to be her Redeemer? Boaz isn't just some side character in Ruth's story. He's a prime example of godly character that mirrors God's own heart. From the very first moment he shows up in the narrative, we see a guy who lives by divine principles, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. When he gets to his field and greets his workers, saying, "The Lord be with you," and they reply, "The Lord bless you," Ruth 2:4, you can tell this isn't your average boss. He fostered an environment of mutual respect and shared faith, where God's name was honored in the daily grind of life. When Boaz spots Ruth working in his field and asks about her, his response upon hearing her story is immediate and super generous. He doesn't just let her keep gleaning. He tells his workers to intentionally drop extra grain for her, ensures her protection from any harassment, and invites her to eat with him and his crew. He tells her, "I've heard all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since your husband died. You left your father and mother and your native land and came to live with a people you did not know before." Ruth 2:11. Boaz recognizes and honors virtue wherever he finds it, no matter someone's background or social standing. The real test of Boaz's character, though, is revealed in how he handles the redemption situation. When Ruth comes to him at the threshing floor and asks him to fulfill his role as Redeemer, he could have easily taken advantage of the situation. She was vulnerable, alone with him at night, and clearly willing to marry him. But Boaz acts with impeccable honor. He protects her, covers her with his cloak, a symbolic gesture of protection and commitment, but doesn't take advantage of the situation. He says, "Now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask." for all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Ruth 3:11. Even more impressive is his insistence on following the correct legal process, even when it could have meant losing Ruth to another guy. He goes to the city gate, presents the case publicly, and gives the closest relative the first shot at redemption as the law required. Boaz doesn't use manipulation, doesn't hide info, and doesn't look for shortcuts. He trusts that if it's God's will, everything will work out within the bounds of justice and law. And when the other relative declines, Boaz completes the redemption publicly with witnesses, making sure everything is done with transparency and integrity. This is the kind of character God can use powerfully, someone who values honor and justice above their own desires. Boaz's integrity and Ruth's faithfulness forged an alliance that God would use for purposes far beyond their own lives. But there's something even more mind-blowing in this story, how God chose to include a foreigner in the most important plan in human history. Ruth's inclusion in the redemption story is one of the most powerful testimonies to God's inclusive nature. She was a Moabite, descended from a people who originated in shameful circumstances and who, by law, were excluded from the assembly of Israel for 10 generations, Deuteronomy 23:3. The Moabites were seen as enemies of Israel, a people who had opposed the Israelites during their journey to the Promised Land. From a human perspective, Ruth was the least likely person to be included in the Messiah's lineage. But God doesn't see things the way people do. He looks at the heart. Ruth's decision to ditch her gods and embrace the God of Israel is what totally transformed her identity. When she declared, "Your God will be my God," she wasn't just making some shallow religious statement. She was giving up her entire pagan heritage and fully submitting to the one true God. And God, in his endless mercy, welcomed her with open arms. Boaz acknowledges this when he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12. Ruth had found refuge under the wings of the Most High, and he covered her with his grace. This truth is revolutionary. God doesn't play favorites. He's not limited by ethnicity, nationality, or past mistakes. What he's looking for is a sincere heart, genuine faith, and a willingness to follow him completely. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would write, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Galatians 3:28. But this truth was already being shown in Ruth's story, long before Christ was even born. She was living proof that God's plan has always been to include all nations in his family. And here's the ultimate miracle. Ruth wasn't just accepted into Israel, she became King David's great-grandmother and therefore a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Matthew, when listing Jesus' genealogy, only mentions 4 women, and Ruth is one of them, Matthew 1:5. God deliberately included a Moabite in the Messiah's lineage to make it crystal clear that his salvation is for all peoples, all tribes, all nations. Ruth's story shouts that it doesn't matter where you come from, what your past is, or how far you feel from God. If you come to him with genuine faith and a sincere heart, he'll welcome you and include you in his eternal purposes. But Ruth's inclusion wasn't just a blessing for her, it was also the tool God used to turn another woman's bitterness into renewed hope. How does God turn our deepest losses into testimonies of his faithfulness? When Naomi got back to Bethlehem after years away, she was broken, empty, and bitter. She had left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 sons. She returned with only a foreign daughter-in-law, no property, no resources, and no hope. Her own statement reveals the depth of her pain. "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Ruth 1:20-21. The name Naomi means pleasant or delightful, but she asked to be called Mara, which means bitter. She felt like God had turned against her. How many of us have felt like Naomi? When life's circumstances crush us, when we lose loved ones, when our dreams fall apart and our plans fail, it's easy to fall into the trap of bitterness. Naomi looked at her life and saw only loss, only emptiness, only God's heavy hand of discipline. She couldn't see at that moment that God was writing a redemption story far bigger than she could ever imagine. She didn't realize that the foreign daughter-in-law, who had insisted on coming with her, would be the instrument of her complete restoration. But God, in His infinite mercy, doesn't leave His children in bitterness. Step by step, He starts to turn Naomi's situation around. First, through the daily provision Ruth brought from Boaz's fields. Then, through the growing hope that Boaz could be the family redeemer. And finally, through Ruth's marriage to Boaz and the birth of a grandson. When baby Obed was born, the women of Bethlehem told Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Ruth 4:14-15. Naomi's transformation from Mara, bitter, back to Naomi, pleasant, is complete. The woman who had said she left full and came back empty now has her arms full again, not just with a grandson, but with restored hope, recovered dignity, and renewed certainty that God hadn't abandoned her. Her story teaches us that God can turn our darkest times into testimonies of His faithfulness. What seemed like the end was just the beginning of something new. What looked like divine abandonment was, in reality, God preparing a redemption that would blow all expectations out of the water. Naomi's restoration and Ruth's redemption weren't just personal stories of overcoming hardship. They became part of something infinitely bigger, a legacy that would span generations and change the destiny of humanity. But how can the faithful choices of ordinary people have eternal consequences? When Ruth made her vow of loyalty to Naomi on that road between Moab and Bethlehem, she had no idea of the eternal consequences of her decision. When she diligently worked in Boaz's fields, she didn't know she was being positioned to become part of Israel's royal lineage. When she bravely approached Boaz on the threshing floor, she couldn't imagine that her son would be the grandfather of the greatest king Israel would ever know. And she certainly couldn't conceive that 1,000 years later, a descendant of hers would be born in Bethlehem and be called Emmanuel, God with us. The book of Ruth ends with a seemingly simple yet profoundly significant genealogy. Boaz, the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Ruth 4:21-22. Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, became the father of Jesse, who in turn was the father of King David. And from David's lineage would come the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. Each name in that genealogy represents a generation that carried forward the legacy of faithfulness started by Ruth. Her choices didn't just affect her own life, they shaped the course of redemption history. This is a powerful truth we can't ignore. Our choices of faithfulness have consequences that go far beyond what we can see. When we choose to remain faithful to God amidst adversity, when we act with integrity even when no one is watching, when we show sacrificial love and unwavering loyalty, we are planting seeds whose fruits can be harvested by future generations. Ruth wasn't looking for fame or recognition. She simply chose to do what was right, to love with loyalty, and to trust God. And God turned her faithfulness into an eternal legacy. Think about it. Every time we read about King David, we're seeing the fruit of Ruth's faithfulness. Every time we celebrate the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, the same town where Ruth arrived as a poor foreigner, we're witnessing the eternal consequences of her choice to follow the God of Israel. Every time we proclaim the gospel of salvation through Christ, we are perpetuating a legacy that has its roots in a Moabite woman's decision not to abandon her widowed mother-in-law. Can you grasp the magnitude of that? Your choices today, your decisions to remain faithful, your determination to follow God even when it's hard. All of this is writing a story whose ending you may never see in this life, but which will echo into eternity. Ruth's story isn't just an old tale of a virtuous woman. It's a mirror in which we can see the eternal principles of God's kingdom reflected. It teaches us that faithfulness is rewarded, that divine providence operates even when we don't perceive it, that redemption is available to all who take refuge under the wings of the Most High, and that our choices today shape tomorrow's legacy. Ruth was a foreigner, a widow, a woman without resources or social standing, but she had something that transcended all these limitations: genuine faith and unwavering loyalty. And God turned these virtues into a miracle that spanned generations and culminated in the greatest gift humanity has ever received, Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. Today, you stand before the same choice Ruth faced. You can choose the path of apparent security, going back to what's familiar and comfortable, or you can choose the path of faith, following God even when the future is uncertain. You can let life's adversities make you bitter, as Naomi initially became, or you can trust that God is writing a redemption story through your difficulties. You can live only for the immediate present, or you can live with the awareness that your choices of faithfulness are building an eternal legacy. The question isn't whether God can work miracles through you. Ruth's story proves he can. The question is, are you willing to be faithful, to act with integrity, to trust in his providence, and to let him use you for purposes that go beyond your understanding? May Ruth's story inspire you to respond with an unconditional yes, knowing that the God who redeemed a Moabite woman and included her in the Messiah's lineage is the same God who wants to work miracles through your life today. If Ruth's story touched your heart and sparked in you the desire to remain faithful to God, no matter what circumstances you're facing, hit that like button on this video and write in the comments, "I will remain faithful." And if you haven't subscribed to the Biblical Memories channel yet, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any powerful revelations from the scriptures. Every video we produce is carefully crafted to strengthen your faith and deepen your understanding of God's Word. And since you've discovered how God worked through Ruth's faithfulness, paving the way for the Messiah, you can't miss our video. Why did Jesus meet Moses and Elijah? The revelation of the Mount of Transfiguration. Discover the deep meaning of that supernatural encounter that revealed Christ's glory and connected the law, the prophets, and the fulfillment of all promises. The link is in the description and in the card that will appear on your screen now. May God bless your faith journey. And remember, just like Ruth, your choices of faithfulness today are writing an eternal legacy. Stay faithful.